I just got a message from JF on the Worski stream, so that's what I was waiting for, was when the debate would be set up on that stream. So that's part of the reason I wasn't super quick to want to bring all the big guns right away, because what they'll do is they'll look for this video and then they'll try to find, you know, my arguments ahead of time. But that's okay. It's not that big of a deal.
Okay.
I'm not that worried about it.
And so what is that debate on Worski Live? What is that about, and with who?
Well, they were trying to set it up with Amazing Atheist, but I don't think that guy's too great of an intellect. So I don't know if it's actually going to be that guy. But JF said, the schedule is insane. We have a week and a half booked right now. I will let Chris and Andy know that you should be next in the list of priorities after the 27th. So it should be a debate on atheism and theism after the 27th. So next week.
I didn't know. I knew that they were trying to get you on there, but I didn't know that was what it was about. So,
well, I think that's what it's about. I haven't actually.
Okay.
I don't exactly know, but anyway, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and make this. There's no point in making it unlisted. So let me just make this public, because if there's already like 40 people somehow watching this, so
is there really?
Yeah, we're just going to make it public.
That was funny. Well, you're up and coming, you know. I mean, I was reading your book is the one that I read on my January vacation, so just finished it. Yeah, it was great.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that. I'm working on the second one, and I can assure you that it will actually be better. Anytime your first book is out, you look at it and you're like, oh man, that was some shitty writing. And a lot of those essays are old. So this will, I assure you, be a lot better written. So just 1 second, and I'm going to go ahead and make this live, and we'll be ready to go. Come on, what is the stream options? Let's make it public. There we go. Public. And events. Let's make this public. Edit. Yeah, I think it is public. Category. Okay. Anyway, this will be good. If it's just your 60 friends that hate me, that's fine. I can handle it.
No, I don't think it's 60. I don't know. It's probably like 3 or 4 friends at best.
No, that's fine. It is like, we've got like 70 or so, I think, right now. So.
Oh, that's great.
So welcome
that's because of the topic. That's why they're interested.
Yeah. Welcome to Jay's Analysis. As everyone knows, I've been trying for a long time to get some high caliber people on here to engage in an actual intellectual level debate about Darwinism, the existence of God, theology, Roman Catholicism, whatever. And so Mr. Robert Taylor has joined us today, and he says he's got the knockdown argument, and he wanted me to do a live stream, and I said, okay, we can do it. So I don't know what his argument is. I have a rough idea of his background. I'm going to let him tell us exactly who he is, where people can find his YouTube channel or whatever he wants to promote. And so, Robert, tell us about you.
Do I start? I was raised Catholic. I'm not a like active practitioner, so I don't go to mass or anything like that. But thanks to you and some other people in the sphere, I've had my interest reignited as of, I think it all started around the election time is really when it, Pizzagate and things like that. Those things are really, you just start to think to yourself, like, if people hold the symbols, these old Babylonian symbols and things, so if they feel like there's so much power in it, and there seems to be some connection between their power and this interest in these kind of symbols, then maybe the opposite is true as well. Other than that, I'm the creator of a show called Prax Girl. It's on YouTube. We've been interviewed by Molyneux back a few years ago. It's not an active channel anymore. It's we've all kind of moved on to other things, but it's there for anybody that wants to learn economics and more broadly, the science of praxeology, which is really what the show is called.
Okay.
I don't know if you're familiar with praxeology or not.
Roughly, I think so.
Okay. So I don't have a degree in economics, but I have been a visiting, professor or teacher in different universities around the world to teach praxeology. There's basically only one degree. It's in Spain, as far as I know, where you can actually get a degree in praxeology, and it's just a 1-year master's degree. So I don't have that, but I've been.
So it's like the Universal Life Church. It's a diploma mill, and you've got. Joking, dude, I'm joking.
It is pretty. It's pretty easy. I mean, I definitely considered doing it once upon a time, but the show has gotten me a lot of people inviting my team, myself, my co-writer, and my actress, who goes by the name Prax Girl, and they've invited us to talk about free market things, Bitcoin. We were one of the first channels on YouTube back in 2011 that accepted Bitcoin and things like that. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
And so real quick, you're saying that the show was like a fictional show that was educational about economics.
It's not fictional. We don't use Prax Girl's real name, but it's just classes that teach the science of praxeology from step 1 to. We didn't make it to the deep steps, but we make it pretty much to what money is, and then the nature of government and interpersonal exchange and markets and things like that. But we didn't get to like the real thing that Austrian economics is popular for, which is talking about business cycle theory. So we actually never got there. We filmed some episodes, but we never ended up posting them. So it's still a very, very good channel as far as I'm concerned, and very good. And we still get a lot of thanks and interest.
Okay.
But we haven't been active in a while.
Yeah, when this stream gets archived, I'll put all your links up and all that. Okay, so we can get down to the meat here. You said that you've got the guns, you've got the goods. You're gonna put the spanking on me, so I'm ready. Bring it.
Well, before I get to the meat of my argument, I just want to say that I'm not really looking to like, hey, I gotcha, and I think that we might end up clarifying what your definition of God is, and it might end up being that I don't fully understand it, but like, since I'm an active follower, I'm a big fan of yours. You might have an opportunity to clarify, because I don't get it. But from what I understand from your belief of God.
Well, hold on. I appreciate you being cool like that, and that's fine. You're welcome to say whatever you want. I don't mind. But you did say in the message that it was like the knockdown. I'm gonna trip you up. I gotcha.
Sure. Yeah. So okay. Here we go. So if God is an acting being or entity of some sort, he cannot be logically all powerful. And the reason for that is because action implies scarcity, and an all-powerful being cannot lack something. By the definition that I understand people to call to that, the way that you and other people refer to as God is an all-powerful entity. So if action means implying scarce means to attain definite ends, then it implies that it lacks satisfaction. And how can a perfect being be not be in a state of satisfaction? Did I get you?
Okay. Yes, and I'm making a couple notes here because I want to make sure that
I knew I'd get you, and I thought this would be a short debate.
Well, what I mean is I'm gonna restate the argument that you made, and I want to restate it to your satisfaction. And this is one of the sort of pillars of good philosophy, is that you should be able to state an argument to the opponent's satisfaction. So I want to make sure that I understand your argument so that I don't, get accused of setting up a straw man or arguing all day against something that you're not saying. So the claim is, and the actions of an all-powerful being don't make sense, or they're in some way sort of inherently contradictory, because by definition, an all-powerful being can't really be all-powerful, because all action implies some sort of scarcity or lack of quality in that being. Is that what you're saying?
Action, in the very notion of the word, already implies that that you're moving from a state of dissatisfaction into a state of satisfaction.
Okay.
Or I could state it another way, that you are attaining means, something you didn't have before, to attain a definite end that you definitely didn't have before. Or you're using your own, you be using your own means, but that means that you're not in that end. A perfect being, you know, the way that I understand it, would already be in all possible ends.
Yeah.
There's no reason to act.
So two things here is that this definition of what act or action is not something I would first of all contend with, the idea that this is true by definition, or that is self-evidently what action means. So your definition of action is actually strictly from economics. I'm not faulting you for doing that. I'm not saying you can't make analogies to the realm of economics and markets to theism or philosophy at times, but the terminology that's used in philosophy or metaphysics or ontology or theology is oftentimes very specific. And so it's not, it's incommensurable. There might be some overlap at times, but it's not the same thing as the terminology that might be used in another field. So another interesting,
let me be very,
One other interesting point is that this is a kind of reverse ontological argument. And I have heard this kind of argument before. And so it also relies on a bad argument from Anselm, and Anselm in his Proslogion and other works. He gave this argument for that God by definition is a perfect being, and to be perfect, he must have the quantity or the predicate of existence. And so if he doesn't have existence, then it denies the existence of a perfect being. And we all agree that there's such a thing as degrees and grades of perfection. Now, I don't make the ontological argument, and this is interesting and fun as a kind of reverse ontological argument that, again, is very Western in its adaptation. It's kind of like an atheistic ontological argument that's made in the realm of economics. And I would say that really it's first and foremost a misunderstanding of the term act or action.
Well, so let me try to use it in the terminology I understand that you use. The statement human action or action is purposeful behavior it's a synthetic a prioristic statement, proposition. Okay.
That actions have purpose is a synthetic a priori?
Yes. Yeah. Do you believe in synthetic a priori?
Sure. Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
You do? Hmm? No, as I understand it, and I'm not, because you said that you study transcendental argumentation.
Correct.
Which is this Kant thing, right?
No.
And
Kant uses transcendental arguments, but transcendental arguments have been around since at least Aristotle.
Okay. And my understanding,
you're asking a specific question: are there synthetic a priori claims? That was one of Kant's objections, and I'm saying yes, there are.
Oh, yes, there are. Yes. And actually, I get the feeling like you're going to tell me that your proof for God is synthetic a priori.
Synthetic a priori claims are an attempt of Kant to raise questions that Hume asked. Originally, Hume asked these questions about metaphysics. He says, we can't do metaphysics anymore. So what Kant does is that he comes along and he says, how can we ever justify a synthetic a priori claim anymore, given Hume's skepticism? So Kant says in his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that we can't do any more metaphysics after Hume. He says Hume killed metaphysics. That's the whole point of that book. So transcendental arguments, though, themselves have a life outside of Kant. It's just that Kant, at a certain time, was trying to work with certain versions of that, but there have been many modern proponents of transcendental arguments that don't necessarily directly have anything to do with Kant. P.F. Strawson, I think, is an Oxford or Cambridge philosopher. He works a lot in transcendental arguments, and it's not really, I mean, it has some bearing on Kant, but it's not directly related to Kant. Anyway, so synthetic a priori claims have to do with claims about knowledge of the external world. And how can we reconcile the a priori realm with claims about experience? And the claims of the Enlightenment skeptics was that you can't. But as a theist, as a professing Orthodox person, no, I absolutely believe in synthetic a priori claims.
I believe that the statement "action is purposeful behavior" is itself a synthetic a priori statement. Now, the way in which well, it sounds like you don't. It sounds like maybe either your definition of action is different, or you think that the implication of the definition of action does not itself tell us something about the real world.
Well, what I was saying earlier is that I don't think that there's one monolithic context for the term action. There might be many senses or ways in which action is used. Hold on. So, for example, action as it pertains to the fulfillment of human happiness, something like the Jefferson or Lockean ideas of what it is to be happy. That's not necessarily the same thing as a metaphysical claim, say, out of Aristotle about being and action, or God and the world and God and action. Now, you're seeming to say that there would be no actions on the part of God unless God lacked something and he wanted to have some kind of personal fulfillment. We would say that that's a kind of that's a misreading of anthropomorphism. We don't believe that God lacks anything or needs anything or anything like that, but rather that the whole purpose of creation and redemption was just simply the outflowing of the goodness of God. It's not a lack on the part of God. And I mean, even humans can do this. Humans can do a good action conceivably without any expectation necessarily of return. So I don't see how, even if I accepted your definition, I don't see how just because there's action at time that seeks some sort of personal satisfaction, that requires that all actions are thus defined by that.
Well, what we can do is we can try to negate. So you've offered some negations of my definition of action, and I think that they're self-defeating, and I'll explain.
Okay.
I'll explain why. When I talk about action, I'm talking about something that aims at a definite end, and so it seems to me that in order to aim at a definite end, you have to first not be in that end to begin with. So you're lacking that end. Now, how is an altruistic action, which I don't believe in, by the way, but how is an altruistic action not lacking the end that it's aiming at?
Okay, so what we're asking here is a question of ultimately telos or purpose, and you're coming from a kind of libertarian.
How does an action lack causality or teleology?
Okay, I'm not saying that any action has. There might be proximate. Okay, medieval philosophers have asked this kind of question. So there might be a proximate end, and there might be like a long-term end in things, and that really relates to whether or not we're only here in the now, or whether there's also an eternal life or life beyond the grave. So what I'm saying is that purpose, or telos as it is in the classic Greek, or action relating to purpose, is going to be conditioned. How you interpret those things will be conditioned by your view of the world as a whole. So for example, if I only believe that there's the here and the now, there's no afterlife, then that's going to have an impact on the types of decisions I make and to what ends. So why am I doing these things? Most likely, I'm not saying this is true of you, but let's say an atheist materialist, maybe he's just a hedonist. He believes that there's only physical satisfaction. So his actions are done for the purpose of material, physical happiness, satisfaction, whatever. Maybe he's an Epicurean and he thinks that there are some intellectual pursuits, and so he's going to mix his physical satisfaction with intellectual I don't know, vanity or whatever. But the idea that I can take a true by definition self-evident principle of what action and purpose is interesting, because historically most atheists have argued that there's no self-evident principle of action or purpose, and that's why they reject the teleological argument for God. So are you saying that you do believe that there's a self-evident principle operant in the world that is like action and purpose that's not material?
It seems self-evident to me that if I were to try to deny that action is aiming at ends, purposeful, based on reason, I'd be contradicting myself. So yes, I do believe in absolute truth. I do believe in axiomatic, apodictic certainty about things.
Okay, well, you would agree there. Now, so what I would say is that a lot of the things that you're talking about go beyond empiricism. So would you describe yourself as an empiricist, or do you believe that there are universals and these kinds of things? Because that will play into our worldviews as a whole and how they compare to one another, and and whether or not our definitions of what action is, of what a person is, of what free will is, and what ends are, right, is going to be conditioned by our worldview as a whole.
You cut out there for a second, but I think I got most of that. Your question is, am I an empiricist? I believe.
So you've said, let me rephrase it. You said that you believe that there are axiomatic principles and truths, and I'm saying, okay, my next question would be, are you an empiricist? Do you believe that those truths are arrived at strictly by empirical research? And what I'm going to reply is that if you don't think that, then you're kind of beginning to admit that there are principles that go beyond just the material and the here and the now. And I'm going to say those things are preconditions for understanding the world, and that ultimately all of those preconditions, and there's a whole bunch of them, I can list them here in a minute or whatever, they really only make sense in a Christian worldview. They don't make sense in an objectivist worldview where you don't have God.
Well, I can tell you that up until very recently, I thought that logic was a consequence of adapting to nature, and we evolved to be logical beings. And there was a time when we had sublogical or pre-logical state. However, it seems like to me that how humans got to the state of reason is a completely different question than how a priori knowledge is conducted.
Okay, I see.
And so I agree. I agree with you. There is knowledge that is presupposed in asking questions.
Okay.
Okay. Are you surprised to meet an atheist, non-theological person that believes in this kind of truth?
It's atypical, but I have met atheists and had debates with views roughly in this kind of line. Sometimes there are atheists or Aristotelians who are close to atheism who do believe that, for example, there are universals and things have essences. They might not believe in a transcendent personal God, but they might believe in something like that. Or there are Platonists who might be even close in a way to atheism, who do acknowledge, that there's immaterial entities, immaterial concepts, abstract laws, logic, mathematical principles. So it's not unheard of. I would say the smarter atheists move in that direction, absolutely. But let's come back to action, because so you're saying in the previously you felt like in the evolutionary process we kind of adapted this principle of reason, and then you're kind of more open to the idea that maybe it's not just an evolutionary adaptation or not just a social construct, that we have these laws and principles and immaterial concepts that seem to traverse space and time and cultural specifications. Would you agree with that? Is that what you were kind of saying there? But you still retain atheism.
I'm definitely questioning now how it is that reason has come about, and I'm open to the concept that it was not as the result of Darwinism. I think you and other people in the space have been really making a very strong argument for why that's not the case. But nevertheless, whoever the prime mover is, I'm consciously aware that one cannot, we cannot define what logic is, okay? Because in order to explain logic to someone, they have to already have it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's just a given of reality. We just have to accept it.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah. So you can say that to recognize reason in another person, like the way that I recognize reason in you, is a kind of a spiritual connection. I don't mind using that kind of terminology, but that in and of itself is not a proof for God. Now, I think that you're going to say that's exactly the proof for God, and that's, first I want you to negate my presupposition. I say you can't. I say to argue that action is not purposeful is to negate yourself. It's a self-defeating argument.
Okay, so what I'm going to reply, and I want to be very clear, is that there's no self-evident impersonal maxim that functions on its own that's not connected in some way to other self-evident maxims or principles. So for example, when you say every being that acts towards some end, I want to know, first of all, that there's a lot that's presupposed in that very sentence. Okay, so that sentence is not just a self-evident maxim that operates on its own. It's actually very loaded with a whole bunch of philosophical and theological assumptions. For example, what is it to be an independent being that has, for example, the question seems to assume free will. It seems to assume that a being can act in the world. Now, a lot of naturalistic determinists don't believe in free will. So I would assume that you think that there's free will. I mean, conceivably a person could hold this position and deny free will, but most people who make this argument, especially if they're libertarian, tend to believe that there is some reality to our decisions, and that we have volition and we have culpability, moral culpability. And so what I'm getting at is that it also assumes, number one, that action and human energy has some basis in a subject, okay, or a psyche or a soul or a mind or some controlling factor that's making these actions. Now, that's not explicitly stated in the claim beings act, but it is kind of implicit in there that you've got some kind of metaphysical assumption about what a being is, distinct from other beings, and that it can act in the world and that it can effectively make change in the world. Let me make another presuppositional critique of that claim. It assumes that that being is distinct from other beings in the world, okay?
Right, so we could call this methodological individualism.
Okay.
I'm always going to, my method will always presuppose that it's an individual acting and not something behind it. It's not, they're not an avatar of something else or anything like that.
Right, and
I agree with that.
Would you agree that it at least implies to a degree that the being has some degree of free will? I can tell you that in our science we don't talk about these kind of spiritual questions, but we take, I guess you could say, we take will as a given. So I would say that as a methodological individualist, like we presuppose that the purposeful action that we're referring to belongs to that person, when we're studying it. And we actually think that this is the method in which you and everybody else that ever does something, that ever looks at something historical that has to do with other actors, that is the way in which people act. Now, they might not be aware of it when they're writing their histories or whatever, but that is the way in which those are the assumptions that they use when they refer to action. Okay, so I want to make 2 points here. So first of all, again, the realms of something like what I was talking about earlier was delayed gratification. So I mean, I'm sure as an economist you would recognize the principle of delayed gratification, right? So I don't have a problem necessarily saying that all human actions do have some self-referential ends in mind. So even if I, for example, die for my faith, if I died for my faith, it would be hopefully because I believe that, that's the correct thing to do in light of the afterlife. And so in a sense, yes, that's still self-referential. I mean, Jesus even makes this point in the Sermon on the Mount where he says things like, he says, if you petition God, God is your father. He's not going to, if a human father doesn't give his son a stone when he asks for food, how much more will God, treat you? And how much better is your life worth than an animal or something like that? So Jesus makes these claims a lot. There's nothing inherently wrong with saying that it is self-referential in a sort of ultimate sense when I do something like that. But hold on. Because I want to stress again that in the claim that beings act for a certain end that is self-gratificatory or self-referential, there are a whole bunch of things that go into this.
I'm not saying that beings act for a certain end. I'm saying beings act, and that implies that they are aiming at an end. The statement is beings act. Humans act. And you claim God acts, but I'm saying that in the implication of in the concept of action as a category, you've already implied certain things that can be actually they can be created into an edifice that can then be used as a science for predicting logically necessary things that will happen in the future. Not predicting, but basically stating things that will happen, logically necessary things that must happen in the future. Mm-hmm. If so, if A then B sort of propositions.
Yes, but I'm trying to stress that phrase or that claim, it does not operate on its own outside of a larger context of a worldview as a whole that makes sense of all of these disparate things or aspects that make up the phrase. So, for example, again, act, being, purpose, let's just take those three. Those are very, very loaded things, and I understand that in the praxis of economics, you don't go into the questions of what being is. You don't go into the questions of telos itself. Right?
Well, we do in praxeology, which that's why I said that I'm not an economist. I'm a praxeologist.
Okay.
Just telling you, because we actually do spend a lot of time in epistemological questions when it comes to economists. Don't economists actually think that economics is a science that's very akin to mathematics, and it allows them to predict things that are going to happen in the future. Predict. We don't think that economics is a science of prediction. We actually think it's an analytical science that is built off of axiomatic truths. And it does no prediction whatsoever. So I just wanted to tell you that too.
Okay, forgive my misstatement and misunderstanding there. So let me put it this way. In each of these claims of being, act, purpose, even if your study does delve into the epistemology and the certainty of it, those are also loaded metaphysical claims. And so metaphysics is, although not unrelated, it is still a little bit of a different discipline than epistemology. So I don't have a problem talking about the certainty or the epistemic questions of that phrase, but I'm trying to stress a point that you asked about presuppositions and preconditions of knowledge. And I'm saying that it also extends into the realm of metaphysics. And when you talk about beings, when you talk about will, whether you deny free will or whether you accept it, when you talk about telos, these are super duper metaphysical terms. That's their origin. Telos is out of ancient Greek philosophy and the ideas of purpose, right? I'm sure you're familiar with Aristotle discussing telos, Plato, Plotinus. They will all use that terminology and that question as they do a host of other things, and they're very much bound up with metaphysics. Now, the modern approach to all of this kind of stuff is not interested in asking metaphysical questions, as we said earlier, because of the Enlightenment, because of human skepticism, because of Kant's acceptance of human skepticism. But I'm making a different point about what I would like you to understand in your approach to that question, and the way that I'm approaching it as a presuppositionalist is that I'm saying you don't get an easy out, right, to just arbitrarily say, I'm only going to talk about epistemology and economics, and so therefore your God doesn't match up to this idea or this self-evident maxim. Because once you start talking about the self-evident maxim itself, how it works in the world, the history of these ideas, it's all bound up with metaphysics. And the existence of God is a metaphysical idea or claim. And so there's no like, Neil deGrasse Tyson does this with his physics and astronomy, where he says, I'm not going to ask philosophy of science questions because it's all stupid. Well, he doesn't want to ask those questions because he can't answer those questions, right? So in other words, you don't get to arbitrarily delineate the markers of what counts as philosophy, science, discipline, economics, or whatever, because precisely I'm here to argue worldviews. Does that make sense? So act, being, will, purpose, these are philosophical terms, and I'm going to tell you that they require of the rest of a worldview to make them coherent. I don't think you can start with a self-evident example of act as if everyone has this same conception. Everybody in you might be able to demonstrate that in economics, that is like the preeminent across the board way to understand action in the world on the human level. But in theology, it's different, not because I can't answer that question, but because God is not a human. So by definition, the way we view God is that he's known not as a being, not as an entity like other entities in the world, but he's known because he's revealed himself. So it's a different category of being than the realm of human actions. Now, there might be parallels, right? So, for example,
now I have a question. Has he revealed himself through something aside from humans, or has he revealed himself through humans?
If you mean,
I ask you this because
if you mean the natural world, absolutely. The natural world evidences all kinds of things like purpose, telos. It evidences cosmology or a causality. But I don't think that telos and causality themselves are self-evident outside of like a larger worldview.
Okay, but that in and of itself is not a okay. So you're making me aware that I'm presenting a loaded argument that has to be broken down. Okay, I got you on that, but you haven't disproven me, if I'm correct here. So I'm totally comfortable with you telling me, look, the point is that my God doesn't act. So my God is actually defined by blah blah blah, and we'd actually reach. We'd actually learn something about what J. Dyer believes, but right now, or you can tell me that my definition of action is wrong, in which case, we might be saying, well, what Robert says is true based on his definition.
Hold on one second. I got to answer the door, and I'll be right back.
Okay. I think I got him on this one. Saying that the worldview is bigger is not an argument. But I think what we're going to find out is that Jay. Actually,
I had to order answers to your unanswerable. I had them sent right away from UPS. Go ahead. What were you saying? You think what we're going to find is what?
I think what we're going to find is that I don't think I'm going to obviously convince you that God doesn't exist, but I think what we're going to find out is that your definition of God is something that breaks down when you say like God, like when you say things like God reveals himself, implying that he wasn't revealed before, he desired to be revealed. Therefore, he employed nature and man as a means to attain that end, or he failed, and in which case, because not all actions achieve the satisfaction. Satisfaction being a scientific term, not because it's a subjective satisfaction. One starts in a state of dissatisfaction, and then has to be able to imagine a world in which the conditions are different, and then they have to be able to believe that they can achieve that end by employing means. If you've got those three prerequisites, then action, then a person engages in the action. But I think, again, like when you say a word like reveal, what I think as a praxeologist is he acted, and so right there is like we're gonna have to deconstruct a word like revealed. Not that I want to get into.
See, this is why what I was trying to stress at the beginning was that certain disciplines might have an analogy, okay, but an analogy is not the same thing as equivocal statements, right? So in other words, we can be equivocating here, where we take a term from one discipline and we equivocate in another discipline, thinking that the way it's used over here is exactly the same. And what I'm saying is that it's a fundamental of our theology, and you have to understand that our system is a whole. So it's like I believe
this is Eastern Orthodoxy that you're talking about.
Correct. And I believe that the way truth works is more like coherence theory, right? So what I'm hearing from you is something like what's called classical foundationalism, the idea that, like in the Aristotelian or Thomistic sense, there are these self-evident maxims out there. Everybody kind of knows these things, like, basic laws of identity, modus ponens, laws of logic. These kinds of things are kind of intuitive and they're self-evident. And when we apply those building blocks to understanding the world, we can arrive at a kind of scientific certainty about X, Y, Z. I don't believe that worldview, right? So I believe something completely different. I think that worldview has broken down. And in fact, the classical arguments against theism from people like Diderot and Voltaire and Hume, they have shown that approach is no longer sufficient. So we would hold to the idea that paradigms are the ways that people interpret things. So in other words, there's no brute facts in the world. There's no such thing as a brute fact, because when you interpret an earthworm, when you interpret this or that event, it comes to you through the lens of all of your previous experiences of earthworms and money and math or whatever. So, and that's inescapable for any human being. So for us, like, there's a famous book, Structures of Scientific Revolution, right, by Thomas Kuhn. And Kuhn is right in the questions he asks, but he's not right in the answer he gives, because he ends up a kind of relativist, where he thinks that you have that paradigm over there, I have my paradigm, these are never overlapping, they're incommensurable. And our view in the kind of approach that I come from, the schools that I come from the theology I come from, is that we compare the paradigms and to see which ones are coherent and which ones are not. And yes, the ideas of what something coherent is or true or false is a little bit difficult. You do have to kind of flesh that out. But that's why I want to start this discussion, not by immediately jumping into trying to refute the claim itself, because I'm not ready to grant you the claim itself as if it works as a self-evident maxim. And it may work in the world, right? You may be able to prove things, and I would laud you for that. I believe the laws of logic work in the world. I believe mathematics. I believe what classical foundationalist epistemology thinks are self-evident maxims. I do believe they function like self-evident maxims. But what I'm saying is that if somebody comes along and asks the question of how do you know that this is universally true given the limitations of your finite empirical experience, you can't answer that. And that's called the problem of induction. It's the question that Hume raised. It's called sometimes regularity in nature, right? This is the same idea. All science is based on the problem of induction and regularity in nature. And I'm saying that we know nobody has solved this. You can look at William Van Orman Quine's famous essay about blue and grue. He's a famous philosopher in the empiricist tradition, that you can't demonstrate that the future will be like the past to prove a universal, because it assumes the thing it's trying to prove. Therefore, there are no self-evident maxims outside of a worldview as a whole that gives a coherent basis for how there could be things like universal laws, mathematical entities, logic, etc., that function in this regular way that aren't material. Does that make sense?
To construct the worldview would require the presupposition that you've accepted logic already. So
Okay,
no,
but
I don't agree with that.
But you're okay. This is a common mistake that people
Okay.
have done for centuries, and I'm not trying to be a dickhead. I'm just saying
No.
there's a distinction between logical priority and epistemic or metaphysical priority. So just because something is more clear to me at a certain point in time does not entail or necessitate that thing has any kind of epistemic or metaphysical priority. And this is the whole history of why people have fallen into debating the classical proofs. Because, for example, causality, let's take the first cause, cosmological argument, as an example. A lot of atheists who have caught on to this are smart enough to realize that if causality is is given both epistemic and metaphysical priority because it's something that people start with, then
Getting dark in here.
Then causality actually kind of takes on an epistemic or a metaphysical priority over the God that you're trying to argue for is ultimate.
Okay,
right?
let's pause right there. So this statement that you're saying, can you repeat that one more time so that I can understand what you're saying here?
So many atheists have caught on to this problem in classical apologetics, as it's sometimes called. And a good example would be the cosmological argument. So the cosmological argument actually fails because what you tend to argue from that view is, oh, everything has a cause. Causality is therefore universal, and so it must have some first cause. And I'm saying that that's a bad argument because not only is it fallacious, it's inherently in itself as a non sequitur. It also makes the same error that I think you're making, which is to assume that because something has epistemic or temporal or logical priority, that it also therefore has a metaphysical universal priority. And that's not necessarily true. So
priority, by priority, you mean that you have to start with that thing before moving on to the next thing?
Let me give you an example. So let's say that let's take numbers as an example. Let's say that I don't come to believe, I'm from some tribe, and I don't come to understand mathematics and basic numerals until I'm 30. And let's say by the time I'm 30 in my tribe and I learn my numbers, I realize that, oh man, I've been missing this my whole life. No wonder I got cheated out of all them freaking coconuts all these years, right? So what I decide is that numbers, I become a Pythagorean, and I decide that numbers are the mystical answer to everything. They underlie everything. They must have ontological supremacy, right? Because I've come to realize their importance. And I'm saying that it doesn't follow that because of at any time point in your life you realize the importance of these things or their universal structure, that they necessarily take on the role of being more certain or more important or more foundational than some other claim or thing.
Well, then right there I have to stop you, because what I'm talking about is the very nature of the thing that makes you use. So it's like it is the first, it's the highest priority question. But
it's only the highest priority. No, it's only the highest priority in a worldview where you assume that is the highest level of epistemic certainty or metaphysical praxis.
Well, or I am a human, and to think I must act. I must engage in the action of thinking itself is an action. So, I mean, what is higher priority than that?
Okay. But like in the example that I just gave, like with numbers or with causality.
Yeah.
Let's say you believe in the cosmological argument. What I'm trying to say is that it's only as useful of an argument as it is as it matches up to the totality of a worldview, right? So, for example, just because you observe causal effects, causal changes in the world, it doesn't prove that there's such a thing as causality, right? This is a point that Hume made. And
Okay.
even if you prove that there is this metaphysical principle operant in the world called causality that we have the ability to decipher through our mind and so forth, it doesn't demonstrate that there are other higher level realities, right?
Okay. But the thing is that I'm only capable of thinking in this reality.
No,
I'm not God. I'm a man. I can only think it. I cannot think in a super logical sense. I can only think in a logical sense.
No.
And therefore, causality.
There
I
are
can even conceive of something that doesn't have the rules of causality inherent into it.
That's not.
You can't make. Okay. Go ahead and argue from a premise and go ahead and reach a conclusion using evidence.
This is a misunderstanding of the whole idea of meta disciplines. Okay, so there are things like meta logic, where logic is studied not in terms of its formal systems, but in terms of its theory as what is logic itself. How does logic work? Okay, so the argument that I make for God is a meta argument for God's existence. Okay, and anybody who would attempt to deny, as some people do, that there's such a thing as meta level disciplines is really just arguing from ignorance or bad will, because there are plenty of disciplines and plenty of things like engineering, computers that actually use meta disciplines, meta logic, meta mathematical questions.
Would they be employing metaphysical arguments without realizing it?
Yes.
And self-defeating themselves?
Not in every case, but in many cases, yeah. For example, Husserl. I'll give you one example. Famous mathematician who wrote, Edmund Husserl, who wrote the Logical Investigations. Okay, he's a mathematician who then gets into asking philosophical questions because he can't figure out how science works on mathematical logical principles when empiricism doesn't justify mathematics and logical principles.
I mean, induction is a conundrum. It's a thing that.
But it's not just a conundrum. Okay, what I'm saying is that my argument has a variation on a whole bunch of things where there's a whole bunch of conundrums. There's conundrums about what action is. There's conundrums about telos. There's conundrums about what a person is, what free will is. There's conundrums about how all of these things operate in the world. How humans, how do we know that there's such a thing as a self, which is presupposed in any language act or communication or transferal of meaning. There are all kinds of things like this. Another philosophical quandary is objects having identity over time. All of these things are presupposed all of the time by all of us, especially in highly advanced technical disciplines like science, engineering, mathematics, meta logic, whatever, right? Gödel's type questions. Gödel gives a mathematical version, a meta question version of a transcendental argument. I'm not saying he's a proponent of the transcendental argument for God. I'm just saying he looked at set theory and he gave a mathematical argument for that ends up being the same form as a transcendental argument. So my argument is not that, I have to go back to like one single transcendental and fall back on that. What I am saying, and get this very clear, is that I'm saying that all of these things that are presupposed in any action of knowledge, learning, science, the world, whatever, they could be how humans are so constituted to understand things within time and space. This is a very fascinating one that Husserl.
Pause right there. You're saying all presuppositions in arguments about science, faith, and anything else. And then what was that next part? I'm
going to give you a list of common areas that are called transcendentals. Okay, and that means that they're areas that are not empirically verifiable, but are still provable. Okay, so this is a big part of my argumentation.
Okay, just pause right there. So they're provable. They're provable through logic.
Absolutely.
Through a prioristic logic.
Yes.
Okay, so they're synthetic a priori statements.
Not all of them, no. Some of them are analytical a priori statements. That's just a tautology. Well, no, because actually, when we get down to the questions of the ultimate authorities in our worldview or the ultimate foundations, there's going to be a level of circularity, and so that's why our position is coherence theory and not classical foundationalism. We recognize that at the ground level, anybody's worldview will be circular. Even the classical foundationalist who rejects ultimate circularity, right? Even their worldview, we say, will be circular. You're going to have to rely on something that is equal to or isomorphic with the thing that you're trying to prove. That's kind of what Gödel's set theory was about.
So since we haven't, I guess you're not giving it to me yet. You're not taking down my whole argument or whatever. But I would say that.
Okay, but to take down your argument is
I understand.
From my position to show that it's loaded, and then I will deconstruct your argument.
Okay, I understand. So to add some context to my argument, I don't see any I guess you could call you could say that there's a circularity in the argument in that I don't have a justification for logic,
right, or
a way to prove it.
Right.
I don't have a justification for reason or where it comes from or how you can divorce it from action.
Right.
Or likewise, how you can divorce action from reason. They're kind of the same thing. To say that an action is rational is to enter into circumlocution. It's to say that the same thing. All actions are purposeful. Purposefulness implies reason.
That's why I said
it implies a will. But I can't explain what a will is. I can't explain what reason is. I can't explain what logic is. So I guess you could call that a circularity. I call it just a given. It's an assumption in my argument that can't be argued against, because to argue against it is to find yourself in a contradiction.
Correct. That's what's called a transcendental argument, and that is
okay. I didn't know I was engaging in transcendental arguments.
Yes, that is a transcendental argument.
Great.
And so let's give a context to this.
That's probably why I wanted to debate you, is because I heard stuff that sounded like I could.
So for listeners, just for the sake of context, this will help some people, I think. So when Aristotle was, for example, arguing in his metaphysics, there's a famous section that I point to a lot where he makes a transcendental argument. And for most of his logic and his metaphysics and his analytics, he's not making transcendental arguments because he's not dealing with people that ask that kind of question. But when he comes up against the sophists, who are the relativists of his day, the sophists say, oh, that's all well and good, Aristotle, but what do you do when somebody comes along and challenges the law of non-contradiction? And Aristotle says, that's fine. I'm well prepared to respond and logically refute that argument, because that is actually an argument. And Aristotle says it's refuted by the impossibility of the contrary, or a reductio, right? Same kind of thing. And that is a transcendental argument. He says that when you engage in that argument, you are assuming the existence of logic and universals to try to refute logic and universals. And he says that is a contradiction. So you sophists have refuted yourself. And yes, I gave you, now a lot of people, when they first hear this, they think that's not an argument, but actually transcendental arguments are an argument. And to show you that it is a formal argument, you can look at Gödel's theorems. They're mathematical forms of a transcendental argument. They're not the overall super duper transcendental argument. I'm going to give the overall super duper transcendental argument.
What's the English translation of a Gödel argument?
Basically, that he was responding to a guy named Hilbert, who Hilbert was claiming that mathematical numerical systems, basic numerical systems, could eventually be complete in themselves. They could offer all possible proofs for that system. Okay, and so basically, for listeners, what Gödel did was, against him and Bertrand Russell and other characters, he says, no, this is not actually possible, because I can look at set theory, I can look at different systems, Euclidean, so forth, and I can see that there are actually going to be axioms in the system that cannot be proven by the system itself. It's going to be referring outside of that system. Right? So there's no perfect set theory. Other think Cantor with his multiple infinities show that this is not provable. So it's not to say that there's nothing certain or nothing true. It's just to say that there's no one mathematical like a paradox, like this sentence is false, right? Same kind of idea. Excuse me. There's a God. Now, a lot of people, for example, this is just a side note, will take issue at extending this outside of mathematics. Number one, I just gave you an example from Aristotle where it's extended outside of mathematics in terms of basic meta-logical questions with the sophists. There's a famous book that Douglas Hofstadter wrote, Gödel, Escher, Bach, where he extends the principle of Gödel's argumentation into all kinds of areas, like music theory. Now, we're not going to get into music theory, but I'm just simply making the point that there are a bunch of different things that are transcendentals. I'm going to list some for you. That objects have identity over time. This is a classic philosophical question from Plato all the way up to Hume and even today. That there's the thing called induction, that the future will be like the past. That humans have the ability to decode things in beginning, middle, and end in time, spatiotemporal relations. This is a question that Husserl responded to Kant about synthetic a priori. There are issues of the self. The self is presupposed in all this, the existence of the self, right? We could think of many, many more things like rights.
That's Bernard Williams.
Who?
I'm just trying to remember everybody that covers these topics.
Which topic?
Problems of the self.
Well, that's been there back to
it's older than him.
Yeah, I mean, the first person to really ask that question in a skeptical framework was Hume, along with his skepticism of other stuff, because Hume says that we're just kind of a collection of all of our impressions, is Hume's word. He says, so the self is not really an immaterial self-existing subject or psyche. It's just basically we're a camcorder that's recorded a bunch of impressions. So that was his answer to what the self is as a skeptic, right? So the reason I refer to Hume is not because I'm an atheist, but because Hume was more consistent than all the other atheists. He logically followed through on all these things, right? But that's a different question. So there's other transcendentals, the idea that we have knowledge of the past. That's a transcendental. It's not immediately empirically verifiable. It's assumed, right? And you can't use something like a videotape of the past. That doesn't count because that's still the present. That we are separate from the external world. Right, this is a very basic philosophical question that some philosophies and religions actually deny. We're not separate from the external world. Hinduism, right? All these kinds of monistic views, solipsism, those all deny that very basic philosophical question. And none of those things, the idea of rights, that we have rights, that's not something that you can demonstrate empirically. It's something that I believe is true and you can show it, but it really only makes sense within a worldview where there are persons that have a will and have a mind and have the ability to choose this thing or that thing and to act in the world, right? So in other words, it comes in the context of a holistic worldview that I believe is coherent. It may not solve every single question, but it's far more coherent than anything that you would find in the atheist worldview. And that is the argument is that all of these transcendentals together constitute and there's a bunch more, they constitute one giant difficult thing that in the atheist worldview is complete nonsense and contradiction, because the atheist will use all of these things that only make sense in atheistic worldview. And you say, well, what if I'm a Platonist? What if I just believe there's all these transcendentals, but there's no God? The only way that all these transcendentals work together, right, is if there is a personal logos that makes sense of all of these other lower level logos, or what we call logoi. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like you're teasing. You're teasing the answer to why your worldview is correct, but I'm going to guess that you're going to say I can't say it in one sentence, right?
I'm going to say that outside of my worldview, you can't make sentences at all.
Outside of my worldview, you can't make sentences at all. I got that, but that's one transcendental argument, not the transcendental argument.
No, that's it. It's an
aspect. Then I just made the same argument. So what are we disagreeing about?
How did you make the same argument?
I said that to deny that action is purposeful behavior is to enter into a contradiction. It's effectively the same argument. It's like it's saying that to deny action is to employ means, make an argument to attain definite ends, convince me that action doesn't exist. You're entering into an action in order to.
And I already responded to this by saying that one's worldview preconditions what we interpret action, being, will, and telos to mean. Let me put it this way.
So you're not. But I just want to be clear here. So you're not defeating my argument or disagreeing with it. You're saying we're gonna have to have this other conversation. So go ahead, make your case for why my concept of action is different, or excuse me, why your concept of action is different from mine.
Okay, so let's take something like omnipotence. Okay, one might say that is
the grandest idea that
I'm trying to illustrate that what we mean by these terms and these words, it's inescapable that it's conditioned by the belief system that the person has. So I've responded to the.
Yeah, but then I can just use a different word. If you don't like my word action, I can say jungle mungalism. I can just make up words.
Listen, the point is not the referent. That's a semiotic question. That's different from a metaphysical question. So you're stressing something that is borrowed from economic theory, and you're trying to make me give an answer on my metaphysics is a different approach to what those words mean than economic theory. I'm not saying that there's not some overlap. There is some, okay? But let me give you an example. When we say that God is just, for example, okay, we don't mean that is univocal, that it has the equivocal, the exact same sense, right, as when the guy at the law court exercises justice. There's an analogy between divine justice and the guy at the courthouse doing justice, but they're not the exact same. They're not univocal.
Okay, so let me see if I follow you. The guy at the courthouse is enacting what the society has agreed is the proper response to some crime once it's been tried in a court of law, and he's just enacting the conclusion that they've all agreed to. Whereas when God enacts justice, he basically he puts into effect, he changes the conditions of the world so that they are aligned with what he has said is always correct or always good.
We have a belief that's called Apophatic-ism. So in other words, what that means is that any kind of term and everybody in some way is apophatic. Even if you're an atheist, you have some aspect of Apophatic-ism in your view. And what that means is that you can't precisely define anything that is that might extend beyond time and space relations. So for example, if you were to ask me to define the number one, I can't give you a definition of the number one outside of the context of setting it over against other ideas like the number two or 0.19, 0.20, 0.21, or whatever. The number one doesn't function as a self-evident thing outside of all of these other numbers, right? So if you were to ask, if we say, for example, you ask me, is God one? I say, yes, God is one. But that does not mean that there's an equal sense between the number one and God as one, okay? Because God is not, by definition, encapsulated, defined, or classified by any strictly human notional category, right? So this is why what we call, in our view, it's an analogy, right? But it's not an analogy to what God is inherently in himself. It's an analogy to what God has revealed about himself. And I'm going to let me give you an example of how I could prove that between you and me. So when you message me, you are exerting human energy, right? And you are putting out effects in the world to convey to me that you want to have a discussion on this topic, right? So you are a person, I believe, and you have a soul and all that. And through your body, you extended through tweets and a challenge and so forth. And so I get some vague impression of the dude that you are by the things that you say about me. I don't know everything about you. I don't know your soul. I don't know your inner being, your thoughts, your history. I only know some vague things about you through created kind of analogies of what you've told me about you. Now, in our view, it's a little bit different with God, but it's kind of the same, right? And that's why it's an analogy. God is conveying to us truths about himself in many, many ways, not just through nature. It wasn't like he failed through nature, so he had to write a book. It's many, many ways through which he conveys his existence. And I would say it's all kinds of things. It's design in nature, it's causality, it's the existence of the self, the mind having a logical aspect to it, logos, right? Logos in the world that reality has at its fundamental level, geometric structure, which I think shows design. But I'm not going to sit here and make a design argument in the way it's classically formulated, because that's going to give the impression that I think design is a self-evident maxim that's preeminent over God. It's not. I'm going to show you that
I see what you're saying.
You use design maybe in your argument. You talked about telos, but you're using an idea, telos, that makes no sense if there's no God. What the fuck is telos in the world as a principle when there's no God like I'm talking about? It has no, because listen, it's impersonal, right? This would be the Greek response. Maybe we're going to be Aristotelian. We're going to be Platonist. We're going to say, okay, I admit there's immaterial existences. There's math. There's logic. It's an abstract realm, but that ain't no damn God. I don't want no God out of all that. And I'm saying that yes, the next argument I would make, if a person was a Platonist or an Aristotelian, is I would say that that is incoherent, because you've only admitted logic or the existence of abstract principles or transcendentals in an impersonal, unknowable realm that doesn't in any way match up to the here and the now. That's okay. That's a different argument I'm going to make around the concept of logos, right? And that logos is personal. So the God that we talk about has to be personal, or else our system is incoherent and it's chaotic. So that is where I will take the argument. And to respond to your argument specifically, I'm going to say you don't have a basis for the things that you think you have a basis for. So it's not that within the domain of economics you can't make conclusions or make progress or study or research. I'm saying that outside of the domain of economics, in the meta level of questions of things, you can't justify these principles operant in your sentence there.
Okay, so so for example, I can't I don't have, as I said before, that I don't have an explanation for where reason comes from. What I feel.
How do you know what telos is?
Well, the way I remember telos is I remember the Michelangelo painting, right?
Okay.
Plato pointing up and Aristotle like with his hand out like this. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm just telling you how I remember the word telos.
But I'm saying you wanted me to refute your original proposition, and
how do I know that there's no intrinsic value in things?
No, I'm asking you a very simple question. Of your claim assumes the idea of telos or purpose, and I'm saying, how do you know what purpose is?
Oh, that's an interesting question, and I can tell you that it's not through induction. It's through
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's definitely not through induction. And anybody claiming that they know what purpose is through induction is lying.
Yeah.
Because I can, if I go to Grand Central Station and I see people moving around, there's no reason why they would. I'd have to jump over something I can't document, which is the reason why they're moving around and going from work to home, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, this was Hume's point about why we don't have purpose in nature anymore, and why there's no argument for causality in the external world. And so I'm glad that you see that and you've conceded that. Your phrase originally relies on some sense in which there is a way to know purpose, and I'm just asking you, how do you know? You wanted to make an epistemic.
Yeah, I know purpose through the synthetic aphoristic statement, the axiom that action is purposeful behavior.
Okay, but neither Kant nor Hume or anybody who kind of pioneered this idea of synthetic a priori claims would believe that purpose is something that you can that is actually synthetic or a priori.
Well, I'm not saying that purpose itself is synthetic or a priori. I'm saying that how do you your question was, how do you know when you see purpose? And the answer is basically because
I'm asking a different question.
Oh, okay.
I'm asking not about the phrase itself. I'm asking a meta question, and I've been asking about every aspect in your phrase, right? It's not just contained within that phrase itself. It's loaded, and it includes presuppositions. And I'm asking you, it's not just one or two that you've admitted. I'm asking, there's another one that's very important to this called telos. And I'm asking you, how do you know what purpose is in the world? Because
I'm a purposeful, because to ask the question is to answer it.
Okay, so
I have to have purpose.
So you're not.
I know what purpose is.
So you're not a classical foundationalist because you just admitted the circularity there.
I conceded to circularity like 15 minutes ago.
Okay, but we didn't discuss telos. We didn't discuss purpose, and this is very important because purpose is assumed in all human actions to some degree, right? Would you agree?
Anything that is not a spasm or something that is not under the control of the will is a purposeful action. Even sometimes.
Well, even a spasm could be because it's the muscle kind of, releasing tension or whatever.
Well, let me be very clear. When I talk about action, I'm not talking about animal reaction. I'm not talking about spasms. I'm talking about anything where the human mind or the will can control and adapt to the conditions of the universe in some way. Agency would be it. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about action. So I'm talking about all purposeful things.
So on an atheist worldview, how do you know that there's such a thing as purpose that's operating in the world?
By thinking about it. Because I asked the question, and that question itself answers itself.
How do you know that it's operating in the world?
So how does it become synthetic is what you're asking me.
As an atheist on a materialistic worldview, let's say, excuse me, you admitted there might not just be material. On your atheistic worldview, how do you justify the principle operant in the world, not just in your mind, but presumably in the world, of purpose outside of your own mind? I mean, you assume that other minds have purpose, right? But you don't have access directly to their mind.
No.
So you don't empirically know if they literally have purpose in their head or not.
No, I assume it.
Right. So on what basis do we have any justification for believing in telos outside of you just saying it's a self-evident maxim?
On what basis? Well, because if I was to try to enter into a debate with someone and not assume telos, I'd be talking to myself, right?
So you're giving a transcendental argument for telos.
Okay.
But your first proposition in this debate is predicated on classical foundationalist epistemology, which rejects transcendental circularity. So you have to give.
So make your case there. How is my first question, or how is my first argument really founded on classical foundational?
Okay, so from
argumentation.
So post-Enlightenment, most of the Western philosophers who would make this kind of Randian objectivist style of argument, I'm not saying that you completely agree with Ayn Rand. I'm just saying that this approach in epistemology is generally called classical foundationalism, and it is the school of thought that believes post-Enlightenment that, and ultimately it's kind of what Aquinas thought too. So it's Western characteristically. Are
you saying I'm Catholic?
You were raised Catholic, so in a way you are kind of fleshing out this this classical sort of Thomistic view of things. And what I'm saying is that system relies on self-evident maxims and principles. Anybody can go look up what classical foundationalism is, and you'll see what I'm saying is true. And I'm saying that it's fine for certain types of things like studying mathematics or whatever, but it doesn't work when it tries to solve or argue meta level questions. The existence of God is a meta level question, especially in my worldview and the argument that I'm coming from. And so in order to try to engage in it, you end up rejecting classical foundationalism. And therefore your approach is not going to work. That's what I've been trying to argue for the last 2 hours. It's going to rely on transcendental arguments, and
So
classical foundationalists don't believe in transcendental arguments. 99.9% don't.
okay, I guess I'm the first one that does.
But that you'll have to give up self-evident maxims because telos doesn't operate outside of a context. Would you agree with that? That like if you come to the debate and you want to talk about telos, like telos, while it is outside of experience, you still learned about it through your lifespan, correct? I mean, unless you believe in like previous.
Okay.
life.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm following on this. So telos, I had to learn from someone. Someone had to present to me the concept of axiomatic truths before I could make the argument. I had to.
Well, you might have as
I'm not a brain in a vat, right?
Right. As a kid, you might have told somebody in a argument or a spat or something. There's no purpose in what you're saying, and so you might have been engaging in using telos without knowing about telos. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that what?
Oh, I see what you're doing, and you're connecting two things that are separate from each other. My arguments, I see that you're trying to say that I'm making transcendental arguments which rely on telos, as you're calling it, and
it relies on all the things I've been listing the whole time.
Right. And you're saying that I cannot divorce the universal laws that govern action as the science that I like to study lays out. You're saying that I cannot excuse me, sorry, I'm getting a call. You're saying that I cannot divorce them from so you're saying that these axiomatic truths and this entire edifice that I follow cannot be divorced from the questions, the teleological questions and the epistemological questions that underpin it. And I'm saying, and here's I guess I think we're actually reaching something interesting here.
Yeah.
I'm accepting that I cannot resolve some of these foundational problems, and then I'm moving forward. And you're saying, hold on,
you can't move forward.
I can't move forward.
Right.
And I'm saying, and I think so. I think that this is now where the conversation has to
as every atheist wants. He wants to have his cake and to eat it too. And this is really.
I'm not pushing forward. I'm not pushing forward because that wouldn't be fair to you. I'm willing to have this conversation. I think that most atheists, and by the way, I'm not saying that I'm very. I'm not the best schooled person in epistemology, but I do like to talk about these things. So I'm not going to push forward. Let's stay right here.
Well, I'm just trying to illustrate. I'm not saying this against you. I'm saying that. Let me be a little bit more clear. In many debates of this nature that I've had, what you tend to see, and this is a point that I stress in the apologetic argument, is the dual nature of atheism. Again, this is not against you personally, but what tends to happen is that kind of approach wants to have its cake and to eat it too. It wants to be able to utilize a lot of things to argue against theism and Christianity or whatever that don't make sense on its grounds, but it also at the same time wants to kind of, like maybe there are some immaterial things and maybe there are abstract things and this, but I'm not going to go where you're going. And I'm also stressing that for you to be consistent, you can't have classical foundationalism and the denial of classical foundationalism. Those two approaches don't work. And the history of philosophy has borne that out.
I am somewhat aware of in the epistemological foundations of praxeology that they do accept a dualistic approach to the science. I'm not,
Okay.
like I said, I'm not an expert in these parts, usually because we don't talk about them too much. But I'm definitely like, I'm game to talk about it. I guess but we could cut to the chase if if you were just more accurate in your definition of like what action is when you say that God has performed an action, or Hebrews, you said revealed. That's an action as far as I'm concerned. And what you need to clarify is what action means in the context of an omnipotent being.
Okay, I've tried to stress already that for us, all the statements about God are in a degree a kind of analogy. So I've addressed your objection multiple times, but I think it might be unclear, or it might be due to unfamiliarity with our theology, which is fine. I don't expect everybody to be familiar with all the precisions of Greek terminology and Orthodox terminology, but I tried to give you an analogy between you and I and the Twitter messages, right? So I'm saying that when you acted in that way, you used human energy proper to your human nature to convey something about your hypostasis, your person, who you are. And I learned some things about you, but I did not learn everything about you. There's some what's called apophatic or unknowable aspect about you, because I'm finite. There's always going to be something apophatic about you, God, the world, anything. I'll never have an omniscient God's eye perspective, so to speak, of any object or person in the world. So when we speak of God, when we talk about God having love, or God acting to reveal himself, or God having justice, or whatever, we are speaking of terms that signify not what he is in his essence. We don't equate all those things with the divine essence, but only to specific actions or attributes. And so just as you might build a house, and if you build a house, I don't know everything about your essence, but I learned some things about what you conceive of a house to be, right? If you convey to me that you beat up some dude who was hitting on your girlfriend, then I have a sense of what you believe justice is, right? So I'm saying that for us, there is a revelation in Scripture, yes, and that because God is who he is in our view, he has the ability to do that. There's nothing contradictory in our worldview with God having the ability to reveal himself in that way.
Before I respond to that, my headphones are about to die. I have another pair. Can you hold on 1 second?
Sure. I'm going to use the restroom while you do that.
Yeah.
Oh, what's up, all you viewers out there? I can't believe these impromptu debates get, what have we got here? Quite a few viewers. Shit, I closed out my screen. Where'd it go? We've been going at this for about 2 hours, and we have 230. That's good. I like that. Waiting for him. So anyway, if you're new to this, if you just clicked on, I'm Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You can go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe to my talks, lectures, podcasts, interviews. I have 1,000 articles I've done. I have a book. You can get all that good stuff there. And let's see, we got in the chat anything going here? Where's the super chat? Any super chats? Here we go. People in the chat. Fix Google Chat. I don't control Google Chat, dude. Yes, my book is Esoteric Hollywood. Yes, it is endless content. Yes, exactly. This has been a great discussion. I'm glad we did this. You cannot see when you talk. I can't see when you talk. Anyway, are you there? Your microphone can't hear you. You can't see my face? Why can you not see my face? My camera not on? Can you see me? People in the chat, can you see me? Can you hear me? My webcam won't work. That's weird. Why is that happening? Nobody can. Okay, nobody can. Nobody can see. Can you? Anybody?
See fine. Can you hear?
What the heck is going on with this stupid thing?
I hear you.
You're like a robot voice now. What is going on? I wonder if I should like restart this. I got a damn haircut and cleaned up and everything. Nobody can see me. That's funny. I think let's stop and then I'm gonna restart, okay? Because you're all the people are saying they only hear robot.